Greetings, History of Medicine students. This is Professor Bowen, just here to provide some feedback on everyone's responses to the questions I asked as part of our Week 10 discussions on social constructionism and the French disease. As you probably noted, throughout the week, I consistently refrained from using the word syphilis when describing the new sexually transmitted infection that spread through European societies during the late 1400s and early 1500s. And as I said, part of the reason for this was that syphilis was not a very common word for describing the disease at this time. Given this, you might be wondering, so when did people start calling it syphilis, and where did this word even come from? These are really great questions, and thankfully we can answer both of them. The word syphilis, to start, was invented by an Italian physician named Girolamo Fracastoro. Fracastoro coined the word in an epic poem that he composed in 1530. The poem was called Syphilis, or the French disease. And it revolves around the exploits of a fictional shepherd named Syphilis. This shepherd tends the flock of a man named Alcithous, who is the king of the land. One summer, the story goes, the weather became so hot that Syphilis's sheep all died from heat exhaustion. And in anger, Syphilis cursed the sun god for not caring about the well-being of men or beasts. And he says in a poem, "Why do we call you a god and make sacrifices to you? Were it not better to raise altars to our own king, who can help us?" That is, King Alcithous. Quite quickly, others followed Syphilis' example, and King Alcithous ultimately accepted divine status. He actually created a law that forbade the worship of any other god in the realm. And in retaliation to this, the sun god, Father Sun, sends down a pestilence, a poison that spreads through the air and rapidly infects everyone in the kingdom. And Syphilis is the first victim. One morning, he wakes up with hideous, searing sores all over for his body. And as other residents of the land come down with this affliction as well, they collectively look for ways to appease the god's anger. Eventually, they come up with a way to bring this plague to an end. Their first suggestion is to propose that Syphilis himself be offered up as a sacrifice to the offended god. But in the end, a bull is substituted for him, and a nymph named Amarice shows the people how to placate the sun god's anger. So, from Fracastoro's poem, we can observe a couple of really interesting things. For one, the idea of syphilis as divine punishment is very much in evidence here. The shepherd Syphilis is presented as a contemptible individual, someone who is justly afflicted with a hideous disease. But there's more than this in the story. Interestingly, King Alcithous survives the disease. He actually is portrayed as entirely blameless, even though he was just as defiant of Father Sun as everybody else. So while Syphilis is chosen as a human sacrifice to restore the divine order, King Alcithous gets off scot-free. The upshot of Fracastoro's verses is clear. Rulers are exempt from the judgments of the gods. Indeed, in this poem, syphilis serves as a means of disciplining and punishing the poor, that is, people like Syphilis, whereas the rich and powerful either escape the disease or, if they contract it, they are seen as innocent victims. So the second interesting thing we can see in this text is how discrimination was built into early modern understandings of this disease. Discourses around syphilis were designed to reinforce and strengthen existing barriers between classes. They naturalized inequalities, they justified the existence of social hierarchies, and they reified power imbalances within society. In other words, this whole idea of divine causality had real practical value for rulers. For elites, this idea could be used as a tool of governance, of discipline, and of punishment. This idea was, in other words, a political instrument. But why was this? Why was medical discourse around syphilis so politically conservative? Why did it serve the interests of those in power? Why did it reflect the ideologies of politically and socially dominant classes? In answering this question, we should note that many early writings on syphilis were in fact commissioned by princes, cardinals, and other temporal and spiritual authorities. Even when this was not the case, doctors often dedicated their writings to rulers in the hopes that doing so would help them curry favor with elites. A good example of this is Caspare Torella's pox tract, which was called Tracticus cum concilis contra pudendargum seu morbum Gallicum. This was published in 1497, and it was dedicated to Cesare Borgia, who at the same time was a cardinal and the Archbishop of Valencia. Interestingly, that very same year, Torella, the physician who wrote this book, had treated Borgia for syphilis, along with 17 other members of the Borgia family in papal court. While Torella generally saw syphilis as a disease that was brought about through sinful behavior, like most doctors did, when it came to the Borgias, he was much more tolerant. He instead portrayed this in incredibly non-judgmental terms. He discussed his patients in a way that was completely free of blame or moralizing. There was, in other words, in his writings, a kind of double discourse on syphilis. And Fracastoro does the same exact thing. In the preface to his poem, he notes how, quote, "Among the first victims who were attacked in our climate, that is, in Italy, I could mention a number of patients who were spontaneously attacked without having exposed themselves to the last chance of contagion." Fracastoro here is creating a new category of disease, what we might call syphilis of the innocent. And this category is reserved explicitly for those in power. When they get syphilis, it is no fault of their own. But when the poor or the powerless get it, it's because they deserve it, so says Fracastoro. Like Torella, Fracastoro's double discourse on syphilis owed to the patronage he so eagerly sought. His poem was, in fact, dedicated to the future Cardinal Pietro Bembo and also to the current Pope, Leo X. Fracastoro was undoubtedly trying to ingratiate himself with local religious and political authorities. We can see this in an early passage in the poem where he speaks in a very flattering, sycophantic tone about the way that Pope Leo has transformed the city of Rome into paradise on earth. The passage reads, "We must never fail to mention, among the gifts given us by the gods, great-hearted Leo," that is, the Pope, under whom the mighty Rome lifts high its head, and Father Tiber rises from his banks and roars congratulations to triumphant Rome. Under his auspices, that is, under the leadership of Pope Leo, the evil stars have now at last retreated from the world, and now Jupiter in his benign sphere reigns and pours pure rays through heavens freed from tempests. Therefore, while others sing of these great events and make poetry from famous deeds, let us, whom the fates call to tasks which are not so great, continue with this amusement we have begun, too far as our slender muse allow. We can see here how Pope Leo is presented in a very positive, almost heroic light, as someone who created a golden age and built an era of peace and prosperity and social harmony. Fracastoro praises his patrons rather effusively, And this governs the way that he explains syphilis's causes, consequences, and its cures. Like many early writings on this disease, Fracastoro's poem is a highly political document. It thus serves as an excellent example of how very real social, political, cultural, and economic factors drive the way we think about disease, not just syphilis, but all diseases. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for now. Thanks for watching and listening to this comment response video. Of course, if you have any additional thoughts on this, please feel free to let me know, however best works for you. Until next time, this is Professor Bowen signing off. See you all soon. Bye-bye.